Oh, God. Yeah, I still look like I just woke up. I can't seem to fix that right now. It is what it is. So, one of the things that I've been working on this year is my setting for storytelling. And I could have done any number of other things for a video tonight, but this is the one that's been picking at my brain all day, so this is what I've been playing with. I have a setting that I'm using for stories, role-playing games, potentially a computer game, and stuff like that. And so it's gone through some iterative experimentation, and at this point, I'm doing some heavy revising of my setting as I'm playing with it. I've got an overall sense of the general structure. So, sort of a recap of what we've done before is this setting started out as an attempt to do a multi-world fantasy setting. So we were going to start with a very central universe in which the characters unknowingly play semi-divine beings who could then be banished into fragments of themselves that exist in lower worlds. It's not really as clean cut as that was back then now. Basically, the ending structure that I've got so far is you have a central world that you have residents who live within, and those people have their essence constructed of fragments that exist in other worlds. So, I guess the way I describe it is if you took a plane of water and you took a hand with its fingers extended and you just passed that hand into the plane of water, now it looks like you've got 5 separate entities, but they're all part of the greater whole. And each one of these separate things is a person living its own life, unaware of the fact that it is only a portion of the being that it really is. And in that central realm, you have that central being who could be cut off and then have these tendrils like the cuttings that you take from a plant so that they can actually grow into a whole nother plant. It's sort of a rough play at that concept, but as we think about this setting in overall terms, I started with 3 worlds, and then I sort of got hung up on the idea of 6 worlds, doing a hex crawl map, structuring it around the flower of life pattern, and so we've ended up with a universe that is way more complicated, but in a way where things fit together in an interesting way. They sort of form networks that make sense. So in each of in the central realm, there are 6 races. Well, there's sort of 6 races. I should qualify that. So in the central realm of my setting, you basically have the premise that the universe is, as far as they know, this continent that floats in the sky like an island in the ocean. And if you fall off the edges of this continent, you have no gravity, so you can just sort of swim through the air. That's part of the gimmick. But into the formation of this realm is the idea that at the beginning of time, somewhere from outside of time, entities intruded and tore open the nothingness but not nothingness that was non-existence. So it created existence from this interaction between outside of time and space and not yet time and space. And the interaction between the two of them created a sort of response. You have this Cthulhu-like entities intruding into nothingness, and their sowing of chaos required that there was a response of a formation of order. And that formation of order was the first mothers. And so we ended up with the idea of 3 at first, but eventually it became the 6 first mothers. And each one of those first mothers populated the world with their children. But each one of the first mothers functions as a world within her. So she generates the spirits of the world within her into the central realm as her children. So the 6 first mothers were Sira, Orta, Mira, Olian, Dunia, and Lumia. And those were the 6 first mothers. But I've sort of structured it around the idea of those 6 first mothers are the mothers of at least 3 different races herself. So each one of them had 3 different types of children, roughly. So basically, the one that we would think of as human would be Orta, and she had humans, giants, and holder folk is where I'm going with now. Before, it had been humans, trolls, and giants. Subtle difference between a holder and a troll, but it's an important distinction, I think, to make at this point. And then the other important factor I had been working on was, like, in what order did that happen, and how did it happen that she mothered 3 different races? And part of that thinking process in my head has sort of resulted in the idea of sort of like the Incredible Hulk, or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or werewolves, or things like that. You have a base form and then a powerful sort of monstrous primal form that they can assume on top of that. Not quite a Pokemon evolution concept, but something of that sort. And the way I ended up going with that is, that the form you get is, say, with the dwarves. You have Lumia was the mother of the dwarves, and she had emerged in dwarvish form, had dwarvish children, and then at some point found a way to transcend the dwarvish form into a dragon form. This is, in my head, this is based on the idea of, I believe it's Fafnir, which is a Norse myth of a dwarvish family where one of them died and they sought to bring him back, and when they brought him back, he was so greedy that he turned gradually into a dragon and ate them or killed them or something like that, and built a horde. And later in his life, a hero came along, slew the dragon, and claimed his horde. But he started as a dwarf and became a dragon. And so to me, that's where my brain started to play with that. And it helps in the sense that in Norse mythology, there's a race called kobolds, which is a type of dwarf. But in Dungeons and Dragons and most fantasy as we know it now, thinks of kobolds as draconic or humanoid dragon forms. And so kind of putting in the middle of that situation, you have the dwarf and the dragon, and then the kobold in the middle. And so I have a few other things similar to that line of thinking. But I've sort of bounced off of, like, sometimes things don't fit quite right. And I'm like, I keep messing around with it and I keep switching things around. But overall, what I think I'm probably going with is it bugs me a little bit, but with humans and Holder folk in mythology has two tendencies to be referred to as things. Holder folk generally means hidden folk, or the people in hiding. And that's usually used in the same way as some mythology refers to the Fae. It's a non-specific term for mystical beings. But they also have a tendency to be referred to as being quite human in appearance. The only way you'd know the difference is if you saw around behind them, they're either hollow from behind or they have an animal tail, like a fox tail or a cow tail. And so they do resemble humans to a certain degree. I do think that's fitting. I feel the three-way structure that I've built here was based around the idea that I wanted to have humans, I wanted to have half giants, and I wanted to have some of those other races that are there. And in order to get a half giant, you have to have giants. And the species of being that most resembles a giant and fits best would be humans. So originally my structure was to go humans, trolls, and giants. The trolls being that kind of bestial middle ground where the kobolds, the little draconic men, are the halfway point between the dwarf and the dragon. They're dwarvish dragons or draconic dwarves. That fits. If you take a look at the idea of elves, or in my case, Andlang Fae, they're an elf. And then on their far side are the nymphs, the dryads and the nixies, and the basically elves that are bonded to parts of nature. And I took a look at that and I said, okay, so where's the middle ground between the two of them? And I had to do it like a hack job of making something fit in the middle of that. Okay, so human dwarves. The other one we did was gnomes. Gnomes, and then weirdly, this one tripped me up a lot because for this one, I did gnomes on one side, and what do they become? Like, do I do gnomes and giants? That doesn't feel right. Like, if I want to have half giants, do I do a gnome and a giant? Because if I do that, I've got to make some other real serious thought processes involved in this. Maybe I'll do that. Maybe I'll revisit that and go back over that. But what I ended up playing with was gnomes, fairies, and then harpies. And the reason I went with that approach was to do gnomes are going to be tiny people. They're going to be a little bit bigger than your average apple in height. They're not going to be as round as an apple. So if you're going to have gnomes be that size, their next counterpart in that trilogy that they are in could also be creatures that tiny, and that would be fairies. And so gnomes and fairies seem to work decently. But what's the third form? I kind of went with harpies, because you went from fairies to harpies. You have these flying female figures to flying female figures. I don't know how well that works because gnomes are not flying figures. But also on that same spectrum is the issue with the human giant problem. Like, theoretically, I can do humans, giants, and holder folk, but you've basically gone human-sized, giant-sized, human-sized again with the holder folk at the end of that sequence. And I'm like, I don't know how to handle that. It doesn't fit nicely into the patterns that I was playing with before. And so I've played with something so much at this point that I've broken it. But it's, and then the final of the 6 races, you have the animals, dwarves, harpy gnomes, set, the fae, the humans, and then you have what I'm currently referring to as the Naga, the serpent people. I have another name for them that I use when I use them more importantly. I have a lot of shorthand terms that I'm using. Humans are humans, dwarves are dwarves, elves are elves. But in truth, when I refer to the elves, I call them the Andlong Fae, the dwarves are the Dwargar, the humans are humans, animals are animals or fauna. So each set has its own kind of name to it for the setting in specific. But the Naga, they're required for me to use the Naga as one of them. I felt from early on that I liked the idea of doing mermaids as a sort of extension of that. So the Naga would be snake from the waist down, and the mermaids are fish from the waist down. That works reasonably well. I don't know that I like my third choice, which was squid from the waist down, and I'm going to have to rethink some of that. Because I don't think it quite fits with what I'm doing. So I'm playing with that a little bit, and I keep bumping my head against like things I've done before and wanting to, preserve those paths that I built. But at the same time, realizing that, like, no, I've built in some other features that make this no longer viable. I should just abandon this silly idea. Like, I really think, like, the harpy, fairy, that's a good pairing. Should there be a third for that? I don't know. I do kind of need to have the gnomes. I don't know what the right path for fixing that is. But the other thing I've done with the structure of some of this is each one of the races has a distinctive quality, a choice path they've made as a species that's sort of morally gray at best. And so, like, originally I had it that the dwarves were the one who were harvesting food from living animals that regenerated the injuries that were done to them. I ended up thinking that dragons were the right ones for them to be carving from, but would they carve up their own first mother? That feels quite wrong. And it especially felt strange in the realization as I went along that the ones who are going to be shaping life forms were going to be the elves. So dealing with bone, blood, muscle, gristle, bile, those types of things for their own uses and twisted behaviors, those are going to be the fae, the elves. So the dwarves kind of got changed over back to, weirdly enough, back to one of the original ideas that inspired this whole setting idea, was the idea of dwarves who replace their damaged limbs over the centuries of their lifetime with stone pieces. And gradually they become more and more stone, until someday you have basically a stone statue that's inhabited by the spirit of a dwarf. And I kind of went back to that mindset. But the gnomes have a feature that I was really kind of into at a certain point, and I want to maintain that feature. I don't know if it has to be gnomes that do it, and it's a struggle, because I do like that element of mini people, like that small scale person as a player character, that size of an apple character. Fairies work moderately for that. I don't know how else I would alter that. But at any rate, the feature that the gnomes had were that they are dabblers in the reshaping of life forms. And part of that was taking animals and doing essentially what the Island of Dr. Moreau was about, was vivisecting and altering these creatures while they lived to become other things. In this case, the obsession with altering these creatures is one which has them anthropomorphizing them. So essentially taking a goat and making a human goat, which would be a satyr. Taking a cow or a bull and making minotaurs. And that whole idea I still want to maintain. I don't know if that's the right path, depending on, like, that still has to be done. I don't know that I'll stick with gnomes. I don't know what makes the most sense now. And I find myself questioning that more. Like, I have no question that I want to have the serpent people. I have no question that I want humans. I want an elf-like population. I want a dwarf-like population. I want animals. So wolves and bears and mountain lions and those types of creatures. All that works. The dwarves become kobolds, become dragons, works. The fae and the dark fae and the nymphs, that works. Those really don't need any fiddling. So the dwarves and elves segment of the 6 races works. Animals works. It's just fine the way it is. The problem I'm having is, where do giants fit in? Where does the gnome fit in? And how they fit together with the things I have set in place for them. And I don't know the answer to that yet, and I'm bumping my head against it. And so some of what I need to work on for that to work out is the worlds that each of the first mothers represents. So in the human world, we have humans on the central world, but as each of the first mothers came into being in that world, the first tier of races that she birthed are going to be the sole inhabitants of that world. So that's a lot of jumbled gobbledygook for saying that. If humans are the first one, so Orta is the mother of humans. So if you establish it that Orta came into being and she birthed Holderfolk first, then the world of Orta is inhabited entirely by Holder folk. Now, there are parallel Ortas that will potentially have the other races of her children. But each of the worlds that we're going to build out of the 6 worlds, each has only one race in it. And that race is the primary race that she birthed in the central realm. So in the case of the dwarves, in the world of Lumia, the dwarves are the primary inhabitants. In the world of Olean, which is the elves are the primary inhabitants. In Dunya, animals. In Sira, the Naga. That all fits fine. That works perfectly fine. The world of Orta was meant to be the superhero setting. So this is people in tabards with capes, swords, and masks living in a city like a Babylon and having superheroes, essentially. This is Dungeons and Superheroes. Not Dungeons and Dragons, Dungeons and Superheroes. Now, we can still run with that pattern. The problem I have is, where do Holder folk fit in and where do giants fit in? I'm pretty set on the idea that humans and Holder folk are either end of that spectrum. But what does that leave for the middle? And I'm using giants right now because I wanted to have half giants in the setting at some point. But I may have to just let that go. And then the other hurdle I come across is, with the Naga and mermaids, who's the third party to that set? And then further down the line, if we have harpies, fairies, who's the third party to that set? And whoever is the third party of one of those sets is going to have to be the one that vivisects and alters the species they encounter. Because we're going to have our minotaurs and our satyrs and those types of things. So I don't know. I don't know what makes the most sense. Like, if I end up trimming gnomes out, and I end up trimming out the cephalopods, the squid people, and I end up trimming out giants, I've got to find replacements for them. And what fits the most? And the thing was that the Mira was the world that I was using for the gnomes. Gnomes were going to be one of the primary races. But I didn't really have as good a sense of where that was going to end up going for the gnomes world as I had for all the others. So I can kind of let gnomes go on that sense. But now I have to reimagine a whole world that they're coming from. And I'm not sure what makes the most sense with that. It's kind of weird to imagine that I'm abandoning the gnomes as I started with them early on. I will say I also ended up equating each of the worlds and races with specific elements. So the gnomes, because of the pixies and the harpies, were air. The humans were fire. The mermaid, naga, and the third one, which was squids, were going to be water. I don't know. Now, weirdly enough, the dwarves were going to be metal at one point. I waffled a little back and forth about it. I'm playing around with the idea of using 6 elements for the world. So the standard 4 elements are earth, air, fire, water. You can do a 5th element, which is life. In my case, I refer to that as quick, because when you're cut to the quick, or the quickening of is the first notice of signs of life for a mother bearing a child. So earth, air, fire, water, quick. We have a 6th one to pull into the equation. And for a while, that was metal. For me, for a while, that was metal. And I may still go that route. I'm not sure. But one of the things I did was, like, when you look at the traditional structure of elements, you have earth as that base, that solid. Then water is substantial but flowing, so it's a liquid. Air is flowing but invisible, and you don't really touch it the same way you touch water. And then fire is, you can't pull it apart, you can't stretch, you can't flick, you can't really do anything to fire. It emits light and it emits heat, but it doesn't have a physical substance as much as the others do. And so you gradate from physical substance to physical fluid to gaseous to almost just straight energy at that point. And following that strain, there was a part of me looking at that and going, like, so earth and water, if you took a earth and made it fluid, you start to get to the realm of something along the lines of a metal, like a mercury or a molten steel or a molten copper. So there was a part of me saying, like, somewhere between earth and water, there's metal. And, you know, if you really look chemistry-wise, you can have the idea of the non-metallics, the metallics, the liquids, the gases, and so on. And so it's not unreasonable to do that. So looking at that framework, I had earth, metal, water. And then thinking about it, I was like, is there something between water and air that I could use? And I thought about things like mist and clouds and things like that, and separating air into clouds or mist and wind instead of plain air. So vapors and gases of a vaporous sort, a stinking cloud, that sort of thing, potentially worked. And then from air to fire, that transition between physical thing to not physical, but affecting change in the world itself through its own energy and its own influence. It's shedding light, it's shedding heat. It has a presence, but that presence is different from the physicality of many of the others. And by that same token, I was thinking that the quick, the essence of life, the quintessence, is also something that is very much like fire. And there used to be a comment that we used to make in science class that was, you know, if the qualifying factors to define something as alive are that it consumes things, it grows, it can reproduce, and it dies. If those are the qualifying factors for what makes life life, then is fire alive? It consumes, it grows, it reproduces, and it can be extinguished. So sort of like it. And so that idea of a thing that's shares those qualities with fire, but also in a certain sense is the breath of life or those types of things. I got thinking, so somewhere between air and fire, quick could meet that qualifier. But one of the interesting things about that scientific discussion was not only did we talk about whether or not fire was alive, but there's something else that reproduces, grows, consumes, not as easily definable as dying, though. And that was crystals. So crystals are something that consumes something from their environment, grows, can reproduce. It's an interesting additional possibility. So there was a real sense at one point of questioning whether or not, I could do a full cycle of these things. So would it be earth, metal, water, mist, air, fire, quick crystals, earth, all the way back around? Or would it be a little bit more along lines, and this is just, it's weird speculation about the cosmology of the setting that I'm building, but would you go earth, crystals? No, see, I feel like crystals would have to be similar to earth and fire. So it would be crystals, earth, metal, water, air, or water, mist, air, quick. But that's 8, and we're already past the 6 elements. Now, to be fair, my setting also includes a sort of hidden fact that there's a 7th on everything. So when we have the 6 races, there's a 7th. For each of the 3 in each of the 6. So each of the racial sets are 3, so 6 sets of 3. There is a 7th set of 3 that is unknown and unnoticed by most populations. There is also, it's based off of the very simple fact that for each of the first mothers, that is a world from which life forms emerged into the central world. The central world is another first mother. And so she has her own elements, her own 3 that are hers. And she would have her own element as well. So where dwarves are metal, elves would be quick, I think. I'm not sure on that one yet. And I've debated because there are whole slews of like little things that I keep moving around and trying to make fit right. But like the Naga are definitely water based. The humans, I went with fire just because it seemed to make the most sense. I mean, that was our big thing. The thing that separated us from the wildlife of the world we were born into is that we could use fire. We are fast growing, short lived, consume a lot, and so we're mortal. We consume and reproduce rapidly, and we grow to a substantial size. We fit those qualifiers of life, and we parallel them in the fire and crystal concepts. So I feel I don't know. Like I have to really sit and think about this a little bit more. But if people have a desire to see something changed, let me know. But as it stands right now, I love the sitting here and thinking about and working out the little differences. Like right now in my head, I'm thinking like, all right, well, why are humans not the quick? And what would the elves be instead? Like harpies and fairies being air makes sense. Dwarves being metal, it makes some sense. But in my setting design, I kind of intentionally made it so that metal is rare. And I kind of want it to be the element of the hidden seventh. So that would make, the dwarves make a good option for crystal because as I fabricated them in my mind, I had them, instead of making metal swords and metal hammers, they were using crystals in their construction, stones, crystals, and that sort of thing. Now, animals feel to me to be the right choice for creatures of the earth. The naga and mermaids make sense for water. I think crystals, quick, and fire are the ones that I'm not as secure in my sense of. Everything else seems to be fitting all right. So I have to think about that. But once I hash out those details, I'm going to start making up some guidebooks to this stuff and sending them to some of my friends who want to play them in games or maybe write stories in this setting. And that's sort of the goal right now, is just to see if I can get it to a good enough state. Like I struggle a lot in a lot of my creative things to define when it's finished, because I can always fiddle with it some more. But there's going to reach a point where it's finished enough. It's good enough to start playing with others in, writing stories, playing games, using as the foundation for making a RPG Maker video game with. Like if I can legitimately just use some simple artwork style, character design, build the world setting on a map that you can travel on, and make adventures happen within that framework. Once I've done that, I can build that out with the stories, the mythology that I'm making on this paperwork right here. So I kind of want to do that. Like I feel the need to reach a point that's good enough to continue with, but not one of those things that I keep fixing indefinitely. Like I can't do that. I can't, like, I've spent a good chunk of this past year playing in this setting I've been designing. There's going to be a time where the cutoff has to be hit. So that's what I need to work on right now, is just solving those last few questions to get it to good enough to work. So that's it for tonight. We're about 45 minutes in. I could ramble more about this topic, but I think this coming week we have to start getting ready to lay out the challenge to do animation. So here's to the rest of the week. Hope you're doing well. I want you to take care and have a good night.